in here, and the West, NATO is going to have to accept, first of all, the partition of the Ukraine. They're going to have to concede the Donbass to Russians because the Russians have already taken it. And they are going to have to put an end to the war. Furthermore, they're going to have to put an end to the sanctions they have imposed on Russia. Because if they don't, Europe is going to freeze to death this winter. I'm talking specifically about Germany. Today, probably yesterday, Russia cut off 40% of Germany's gas over the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. This sent gas prices through the roof. Germany cannot survive under these conditions. So what has to happen now is a realignment where basically Europe is going to have to assert its own identity. They're going to have to break away from NATO. They're going to have to start electing governments that represent the people of their respective countries. And they're going to have to make peace with Russia and restore the energy supplies that only Russia can supply. Because the sanctions now have hurt Europe and they have helped Russia. So at a certain point, we have to start talking about reality. Up to this time, the West has been believing its own propaganda. That's the main problem with the West, because it's run with a group of fanatical revolutionary zealots who don't believe that there is such a thing as reality. They believe you can call a man a woman and vice versa, and they believe that the Ukrainian army can beat the Russians, and these are all illusions that are going to have to be thrown overboard if Europe wants to survive.
All right, that was Dr. Jones's response to my question: how do we bring a suitable end to the war in Ukraine? Well, Dr. Jones, from what you just mentioned, it all sounds like concessions that Ukraine and the West have to make. You haven't said anything that in regards to what Russia would have to give up or what compromises Russia would have to make. That doesn't seem very fair. That doesn't seem like to be a solution that will bring long-lasting peace.
Russia doesn't have to make any concessions.
Really? Why is that?
Because they've won the war.
I don't think so.
That's the whole point of a war, is that you solve the problem by force majeure, heroic Gewalt, or whatever you want to call it. That's how they solve the problem. They have won the war, and NATO is going to have to wake up to that fact. They are not going to give back the Donbass. They do not have to make any concessions. They're winning both the economic war and the physical war, so they don't have to make concessions. NATO has to make concessions.
Honestly, is that okay? Well, since February, I believe the main objective of the Russians was to take Kiev, or apparently that's what we're told.
No, first of all, that's not true. That is not true. Their objective was never Kiev. Their objective was always the Russian-speaking sector known as the Donbass, the industrial sector.
Why did they hurt tens of thousands of young men to their death in the Kiev region, Irpin, Bucha, all that areas, Kharkiv, even as central as Dnipro, and other cities in the center of Ukraine. What was the point then?
To pin down Ukrainian troops. It was a diversion, and it was effective. It was an effective diversion because the Ukrainians didn't deploy the troops where they were needed, which is in the Donbass. And so as a result, the Russians could take over the area that they really wanted.
Right. Okay, well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. That means their sacrifice must be apparently, according to some estimates, up to 10,000 or 15,000 of their troops doing that, just to achieve a slither of land across the border and bordering the Sea of Azov. And
it's more than a sliver of land. We're talking about 20 to 30% of the Ukrainian landmass, Ukrainian territory.
Well, it's a sliver just across the southwest of Ukraine. Yes, that's right. Yeah, up to 20%. Apparently, Zelensky said in the last few days. But okay, so let's say they hold on to this territory, which I don't see them doing in the current state as it is, from all the way just below Kharkiv all the way down to Kherson. Logistically, that's quite a huge demand for any military, and especially one that's not fighting some type of backward opponent. The Ukrainians are definitely not on the same level or don't have the same numbers as the Russians in terms of ammunitions and firepower, but they're by no means a backwards military. They've shown they're quite good war planners and strategic thinkers. They've destroyed several Russian warships. This is an even bigger blow than anything that Russia, I believe, has done to them, and they've taken back territories, especially in the northwest. I don't see Russia taking anything positive long term out of all of this.
Wait a minute. Let's stop here and get back to reality. Let's compare this to Afghanistan.
Yeah,
there was a complete collapse of the American occupation of Afghanistan. Why was that? Because of superior firepower, the Afghan army with its 600,000 men. The reason that collapsed was because the Americans had no purchase whatsoever on the mind of the people of that country. They were always perceived as alien invaders. They were hiding off in their enclaves, just serving time, and then they went back to the United States, and the country collapsed immediately. This is the opposite of what is happening in the Ukraine. Those eastern territories belong to Russia. The fact that they were in the Ukraine was a historical accident that has something to do with 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But those borders did not change the fact that the people there spoke Russian and considered themselves Russian citizens. That is not going to change. All we have now is a military and political adjustment of the ethnic realities on the ground.
Okay. Well, by the way, the Russians also failed in Afghanistan 20 years or 30 years earlier, right?
They didn't gain purchase of the mind. Nobody will gain purchase of the Afghan mind. It's that simple. They are a world unto themselves, and they know how to drive out any possible invader, including the British, which is what happened in the 19th century.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I don't think the British ever got over that defeat. But what I'm trying to say is that number one, with the Afghanistan example, to say that not all Afghanis were against Americans, I don't think is totally accurate. I believe a lot of women, obviously some different groups, minorities, Hazaris, don't like the Taliban. The Pashtun fanatics are the ones who don't like the Americans, and the exposure to the modern Western world in the last 20 years has been beneficial for a lot of, for example, women, educational rights and stuff like that. That's the argument a lot of people put against that. And the Taliban is reversing that in the last 9 months with their medieval thinking, a lot of people would say. And the Americans, again, departed in a chaotic manner, as they did in Vietnam, because of just a lack of I agree with you in some extent strategy in terms of using brute force or being a hammer.
Wait a minute.
Using other tools to.
It wasn't just brute force. You're talking about these Afghanistan women. I met one of these women. She was at the University of Notre Dame. The United States government was paying for her to get a degree in gender studies. Gender studies. Now, gender studies meant that she was going to go back to Afghanistan and get a job working for women's rights in Afghanistan. Now, that sounds really noble until you turned. Well, do you have the job lined up? Her name was Takmina. Do you have the job lined up? She was from Herat, which was in the West. Do you have the job lined up? Yeah, I do. As well, the last person who held the job, it turns out, turned on the ignition of his car, and his car blew up, and he was killed. And so she was going to go back and fill that position. I said, you may end up the same way. And of course, the look of recognition on her face said that, obviously. Well, what happened is that the Afghan people were being basically faced with two, I'd say, equally repugnant alternatives. and they found the Taliban superior to gender studies. And that's not hard to understand because there's nothing more stupid, nothing more inimical to women's rights than women's studies. They tried to turn the women into feminists. That's not going to work. And so they'll go back to wearing the burqa. Now, I don't agree with either one of these alternatives, but to say somehow the American alternative was better than the burqa is ridiculous. It's probably worse. And the point is that the Afghan people have basically made the decision that it's better to wear the burqa than it is to enroll in the gender studies program.
Well, that's a interesting way of analogy. But what I'm trying to, well, I'm not saying either the American lifestyle or the Taliban version of Islam is the right one. And number one, Afghanis, 40 million of them, didn't have the choice to choose. The Taliban, let's say less than 100,000, have imposed their views on them through their takeover, and I wouldn't say military superiority or even savviness. Literally, it's just the Afghan police force and army with their billions of dollars of American hardware collapsed like a house of cards, and they didn't have the willpower or even the bravery to fight.
Right.
Perhaps excluding the Panjshiris in the Panjshir Valley. Now, that's perhaps due to American training, or just due to these people are not on the same level or fanatical as the Taliban, and they don't want to die for a lost cause. But and you mentioned this lady you talked about who went to Notre Dame. Over the years, I've heard about a lot of women being killed, especially journalists, polio workers being killed by the Taliban or some other Islamic group, apparently, car bombings, and this is to deter people, especially women, from being outspoken and even showing their hair on live TV or even being on TV. I think this is not a very good prospect for women anywhere, especially in Afghanistan, right? And into that perspective, this is why most women would not want the Taliban to be in power, right? We can't speak for all Afghanis, and to say all Afghanis chose the Taliban or burqa, as opposed to gender studies or American lifestyles or thinking, I also think it would be an exaggeration, right? But to get back to the logic of what you're talking about, Ukraine. If, for example, Mexico were to say, under Uvalde, where this tragic shooting just happened in Uvalde a few weeks ago, that a lot of Latinos are there, a lot of Mexican speakers are there, and this is our territory. In fact, most of Texas is our territory. He took it away from us, and now we want to invade the United States. What would you say to that? Does that make any sense in the current political reality or in real time?
No,
right?
That's exactly.
This is the same logic that Russia is using with their Russian speakers, who apparently they're liberating with bombs, which doesn't make any sense.
No, it's not. It's not the same. Because first of all, the United States did steal that land from Mexico. They fought a war, they stole the land, and Mexicans couldn't resist it. But the analogy is right. What is happening? What the United States is doing right now is exactly what you described with that hypothetical situation with Mexico. The United States is going to Russia and saying, we're going to invade Texas, the equivalent of Texas. I mean, look at a map. Is Russia on the border of the United States threatening to invade, or is the United States on the border of Russia threatening to invade? Who is at fault here? Who is the imperialist? It's the United States. It's NATO. It's not Russia.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's right. That's how I spoke about my distinction about NATO expansion. Yeah, but I'm just going by the logic, and this is not only a ploy that Russia has used in Ukraine. They've used it in Moldova, in Georgia. Saying Russian speakers are there, and we have a duty to protect them, and that means they whatever the land they're on belongs to the Russian Federation as a political entity. It might belong to the Russian nation or the Russian diaspora, but not to the political state of the Russian Federation.
Well,
using brute force to achieve that. Either way, even if some people in that particular location might like Russia and want to be with Russia. There are lots of other people who don't, who are disgusted by this and even stop speaking Russian and disavowing and disowning their Russian heritage because they identify with the state of Ukraine. Now, are they being forced to have? Do they have a choice, or is Russia forcing them to either join us or die or be bombed out of your houses just for the sake of Russian identity? Or if that's really the reason, because I don't think it's a reason for this conflict. I think just Russia just wants us and wants this NATO to be on their doorstep even closer to them, and obviously they want their strategic military position not to be impeded, for example, in the Black Sea and stuff like that, rather than this notion of the Russian diaspora being in danger, imminent danger, anywhere, everywhere around them, and they need to attack everyone. I don't think this is a good idea, and I think the recent conflict was a bad move by Putin. Yeah. What is your response?
NATO is the aggressor here. The war started in 2014 when Victoria Nuland orchestrated a coup against the legitimate government. That coup d'etat was perpetrated by the Nazis that she had been arming in the Azov Brigade, who were then one of the main groups fighting the Russians. All of the aggression was on the part of NATO at this point. Once the Zelensky, it wasn't the first Jew they put in was a guy named Yatsenyuk. Now they have another Jew in by the name of Zelensky. As soon as these people were put in power, they started engaging in aggression against the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass. 14,000 people in the Donbass were killed by the Ukrainian government simply because they spoke Russian. This is the aggression. Russia is responding to that aggression and protecting people that it considers its own people, and traditionally were its own people because they were traditionally within the borders of Russia.
Well, borders have changed, and there was an agreed negotiation at the end of the Second World War, and even the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was disillusioned, and the state of affairs now is how it was. Is how it is, and I don't see why this is suddenly changing. And those 14,000, 13,000 people who died in Donbass in 2014, obviously they're a mixture of people, Ukrainians, Russian speakers, Russian ethnic groups, and also Ukrainian soldiers fighting the Donetsk People Republic and the Luhansk People Republic militias also, yeah? So there's a mixture of people dying, not just people speaking Russian being killed.
Well, that's probably true,
yeah.
But they were the region was attacked because it was a Russian-speaking region.
Yeah,
obviously there may be people there who prefer to speak Ukraine, but that's too bad because artillery is not really a precision instrument and it kills lots of innocent people. But the area is considered Russian-speaking, and that's why the Ukrainian was attacking it.
Right. Well, okay. Well, I think the reason for the 2014 conflict that started in 2014 and has been going on in the background was because the Donbass region, or the people who have grabbed power in the Donbass region and rebelled, basically just not recognizing the Ukrainian authority or Ukrainian state all of a sudden, and that's why the Ukrainian army had to intervene. Right? Again, we can use the analogy if a group of militia in South Carolina or Texas rebelled against and so we don't recognize the US, we're all an entity and we want to be with Mexico or whatever, and would the US not start bombing them or start attacking them or what, or put them as rebellion?
Well, first of all, if you're talking about the federal government, yes, the federal government in the United States is at war against the American people right now. That is obvious. Merrick Garland should be put on trial for criminal behavior. He's the head of the Justice Department. He has weaponized the Justice Department to go after anybody that the Democrats in power do not like. Okay, I could go into long detail about this, but that's simply the fact. Okay, now that's not right. Okay, but the fact of the matter is that the situation in the United States is not the same as the situation in the Ukraine. The United States established its borders now for either by purchase or by conquest over 100 years ago. Okay, and they have been stable up to this point, and have proven to be stable. The Ukraine and its current borders, the Ukraine as an independent country did not exist at all until 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was an artificially created situation that did not correspond either to ethnic or political reality. The United States, because of this, the United States ruling class became absolutely drunk with power in the period following 1991, and they recklessly expanded NATO ever more eastward until it finally posed an existential threat to Russia, and Russia reacted. That's the reality of the situation. NATO is the aggressor here. In 1991, NATO should have disbanded, because there was no reason for it to exist anymore, because it was created to control, hem in, control, contain the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union no longer existed, and world communism was not a worldwide threat anymore. The fact that NATO did not do this is proof of the imperialistic designs of the United States of America.
Yeah, and you don't tell me about that, right? I wrote a dissertation about that, as you well aware of. But going back in history, we want to talk about history. Yeah, in some arguments, Ukraine, with its borders as it is right now, never existed prior. But in terms of the borders that the Russian Federation or the Russian people occupy as of now, or in the last 300 years, they never existed as a state. It was the Kievan Rus Empire expanded from Kiev, right? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Or the Kiev region, right?
Right.
And this Kievan Rus, to some extent, this Mr. Putin wrote an essay where he if it's to be, where he acknowledged the linked and ancestry of Ukrainians and Russians, also Belarusians, and that's true to some extent. So Kiev and Rus expanding eastward from the Kiev region as we know it today, right? And so in my perspective, that would mean that actually Kiev and Ukraine is the mother of Russia, rather than the other way around, or Russia has to be and Russia has to be subservient to Ukraine. But from Putin's perspective, he believes Ukraine should be subservient to Russia. If he wants to go down that perspective, or going down that history book, that's what happened, right? So you have the Rus Empire and Kievan Rus Empire expanding all the way up to the east to Vladivostok, right? And conquering lots of people, Asians, Asians, Muslims, right? People who most people in the West who would not think are Russians, right? And to my belief, Russia as it is right now has been acquired through conquest, and as Russian people started as a small group, literally from the Polish border in Ukraine, or what we'd have now Kiev and Rus border, all the way to the North Sea, has spanned all the way to China, right? So borders change through conquest, through purchase, as you mentioned. And if you want to talk about history, that's the true history of the Russian Empire and everything that's come about. That's the Soviet Union afterwards, expanding from Kiev and onwards eastward. And the Russia itself didn't exist as a state entity, or it had an empire, or as a nation state, as we would define it as we would now in modern times, right? So everyone has firstly, would you deny my history or my recollection of history?
Well, according to this logic, the Ukraine should be part of Poland then, because Ukraine was part of Poland, the Polish Empire. Except that according to what happened, Poland got partitioned and it ceased to exist as a country. So I don't really see any point to this type of historic. There's no logic, in a sense, to history. History is what it is, and the Ukraine basically never existed as an independent country until 1991, which was simply a fluke of geopolitical happenstance.
And did Russia exist as a country?
No, well, I mean, did Russia exist as a country? Yeah, yeah.
In what entity?
I mean, are you talking about, there is no sense in which Germany did not exist as a country, if you're talking about this period of time. It was a group of principalities that spoke the same language. So if you're talking about Kiev and Rus, why don't you talk about Muscovy? What about Muscovy? Was Muscovy Russia?
Yeah, that's right. The Muscovy, and that led on from the Kievan Rus Empire. The settlements created around the Moscow, called the Moscow area, right?
Right. So what about is it Muscovy that we're talking about?
That would be like a city or a state or a little principality,
because they simply didn't have the wherewithal to create an empire at that point, but the empire did come into being. So why are you arguing with history? Why are you arguing with history? There is no type of moral imperative from history here.
Well, I'm saying a different perspective of history, right? As a state.
Well, as I said, if you want to take historical circumstances into account, then the Ukraine should be part of Poland.
Well, maybe it should, and Russia should be part of Ukraine, and they should be part of each other.
Yeah, but so what? If wishes were horses, beggars would ride. This is not geopolitics, though.
Well, okay. Well, anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I think that the logic of, if it's the true motivation of
Look, let me give you an example. I live in what used to be New France.
Yeah.
Now, does France really is Indiana really part of France?
No,
this is preposterous. It's preposterous to talk this way. First of all, in many ways, I wish I were part of New France, except that Macron is running France, and the French Revolution took place, and there are a bunch of criminals equal to the criminals who are running America right now. But it's simply preposterous to talk about Indiana as part of New France. That was then. This is now. It's not the situation anymore.
Yeah, and likewise, then and now, you're right. This is the issue of applying historical sentiments or situations to the present time. Even if you say, or even if it's true that Ukraine was never a country, and people believe Ukraine was part of what was then known as the Russian Empire, that was the past, and this is now. So why should the past apply to the present for Ukraine and not for other people?
Because of the things I've already mentioned, NATO aggression against the Russian-speaking people in the eastern part being the first cause, and then secondly, NATO's aggressive campaign against Russia. They were planning to destroy Russia. Putin was smart enough to realize that. He had 30 years of experience. The United States, the NATO refused to talk reality with this man, which is what happens when you let Jews run your foreign policy. They lose touch with reality. And so when you send people like Blinken to negotiate for you, you're going to have a war because you can't talk to a Jew. You can't talk to people who have relatives who died in the Holocaust. This is the lesson for Americans. Do not send Jews to negotiate for the United States of America.
Right. And well, are we going to make a distinction between the general Jewish diaspora and perhaps a minority or Zionist minority or Reform Judaic?
No. I'm saying that what we're talking about is as of the partition of Poland. Poland was the Paradisus Judaeorum. 90% of the world's Jews lived in this area, which came to be known as the Pale of the Settlement. It used to be the eastern border of Poland, and after the partition of Poland, all of these Jews ended up living in the western border of Russia, where they became a subversive element that could not be subdued, and eventually this group of Jews took over Russia. And I'm talking about the Bolshevik revolution in October of 1917. This was a Jewish coup d'etat. The Jews took over Russia, and ran it into the ground for the next 70 some years. That Putin was aware of this. He said that what happened in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century happened in the United States at the beginning of the 21st century. In other words, if you let Jews take over your country, you're going to have an unending war. This was Trotsky's doctrine, and you're going to have conflict because Jews don't recognize boundaries. They have this messianic fervor. So the messianic fervor that you used to see coming from Russia that was called communism is now coming from the West, and now it's called capitalism, NATO, and freedom.
Yeah. When did Putin say that? I haven't seen that one.
He said it, I don't know, a year ago, not long ago. I don't have the footnotes here when I do interviews.
Okay. I've proposed this settlement for the Ukraine issue, which is some might say quid pro quo. Ukraine will get back its nuclear weapons it gave up in 1994, in accordance with the Budapest Memorandum. This number about 1,500, right? Now, Ukraine will not join NATO ever, right? The territorial borders of Ukraine will be respected, right? And Russia will withdraw all forces and will not destabilize or invade Ukraine. And well, that was prior to this February invasion, right? Now Russia probably has to pay Ukraine probably $500 billion for damages done, and probably try some war criminals. What that proposal, that deal, does that sound like a good deal for both sides?
No, it's totally delusionary. You're living in a world of illusion. Russia will never give up. They have conquered the eastern part of Ukraine. That's part of Russia now. That's over. That will not be debatable. The idea that anyone could put nuclear weapons on the Ukraine now is a total illusion. Russia will not tolerate this.
Well,
okay, the best that the West can hope for is a return to the status quo ante. This is what Henry Kissinger proposed at Davos, which is basically a recognition that that was always part of Russia, and it went back to being part of Russia.
So you sound like you're admiring or supporting Henry Kissinger's statements in Davos 2 weeks ago.
For once,
where he said Ukraine should give up territory, but from what I understand, he's one of those Jews you're talking about, or Zionists, right. And so aren't you contradicting yourself, Mr. Jones?
Right.
You just said
he's a sensible Jew.
Really?
Most Jews are not, but he is the only adult left in the room.
Well,
they ignored. Look, I'm not trying to defend the career of Henry Kissinger. I'm just saying that what he said what he said in Davos corresponds to reality in a way that what is coming out of Mr. Blinken's mouth does not. And the trouble is this revolutionary cadre has taken over American foreign policy. It's Jewish every bit as much as the Bolsheviks were a Jewish operation, and it's operating in the interest of the Jews in America, the elite Jews, and Israel. Now, the fact that Kissinger came from a previous generation when Jews did not have that power because there were presidents like Nixon doesn't change the fact that what he's saying corresponds to reality.
Yeah. And this is Henry Kissinger, the former, I think is it National Security Advisor or Secretary of State?
Secretary of State under Richard Nixon. He was the one
he was, I believe, a survivor of the Holocaust. He fled from Germany, his family, is that right?
Right.
Yeah. And he came to America in 1920s or 30s. And and his family's lived, and he became one of the best known statesmen of the United States. And his involvement throughout the establishment or the early days of Israel and the rapprochement with China are something that is debatable in all discourse, right? And here he is in the 21st century, in Davos 2022, talking about Russia, about Ukraine giving up territory that Russia is occupying. This is something that is not acceptable to Ukraine, or I would say any sovereign state, right? again, would the US, if China, I don't know, maybe in the next 20 years invades Florida, would it for peace though? Would the US give up Florida to China? Well, is that
Well,
something that
let
is?
me know when China is on the border of Florida, and we'll have another discussion.
Well,
by the way, the United States is in Taiwan, and that's on the border. There's a body of water there, but that's pretty much on the border of China too. So you got the shoe on the wrong foot here.
Well, yeah, okay, well, okay, fine. Well, maybe. Well, we never know what might happen tomorrow, and Taiwan is not a matter. Where people have been making comparisons between Ukraine.
China is incapable of running an international empire. Traditionally, the Chinese had a navy and they had gunpowder long before the West did, and all they did was sail up and down the coast and shoot off firecrackers. Yeah. So they are simply incapable. They don't have the logos that is needed to run an empire.
Well, I don't. Well, perhaps you can explain what logos means, and that comes up in several of your books, right? But I think yes. I believe they don't have the imperialistic nature that the forefathers of the Communist Party or the Qing dynasties or the other dynasties had, right? I believe, yeah. But why don't you just explain what you mean by logos? But I just think they're not imperialistic, but they do show traits of some type of colonialism, especially in their region and where they do business. Wherever you go to China, wherever they've been to, you can see massive amounts of debt, like Sri Lanka, like Zambia in Africa, South Africa. You can see a lot of debt, and they take off the resources, they build roads, stuff like that, but you end up being in a lot of debt and being in servitude. Right. And this is not a form of colonialism or perhaps imperialism, but and this is a soft way or very.
Look, I am not saying that China doesn't lend money in predatory fashion. What we've had over the period that we're talking about, the 20th century, was a communism imposed by force on a traditional Chinese culture, which had a disruptive effect. And then worse than that, capitalism was superimposed over communism. I'm not talking about what has happened since that time. I'm talking about the group, a fact that this group is intellectually incapable of running an empire because all they do is imitate things from the West. Yeah, they are incapable of coming up with these type of decisions because they turned their back on logos when the opportunity presented itself. And I'm talking about when the Jesuit Matteo Ricci showed up in China. This was their moment of opportunity, and they turned their back on it because of ethnocentrism on the one hand and Vatican bungling on the other. It was a tragic moment, and then suddenly they had to get up to speed with the West in a hurry when Mao Zedong conquered the country and imposed communism on it with disastrous effects, which they still haven't gotten over. So I'll give you an example. Okay, I have Iranian friends. The first train pulls in from China, pulls into Tehran, and I call up one of my Iranian friends and I say, in English, of course, since I don't speak Farsi, I said, "Are you going to learn Chinese?" And at this point, she explodes with this, never, 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 never. They have the Iranians are oriented toward the West. They're alienated from the West because of the Jewish hegemony over our foreign policy.
That's right. They're the next target after Syria, I believe. Yeah, go on.
Right. They've always been, because Israel doesn't like Iran, and we are a proxy state of Israel, and so we have to fight Iran. Otherwise, you can't get elected president. That's right. What Donald Trump tried to do. But I'm saying, let's put that aside for the moment. There is a fundamental orientation toward logos in Iran, which has been submerged by the Islamic conquest.
And just define logos for those who might not understand.
And that does not exist in China. China had Tao. If you talk to Confucius, he believed that there was something called Tao, which the early Jesuits thought, well, maybe this is logos. But the more they looked into it, the more they realized, no, it's not They need to understand a deeper understanding of the reality of the universe. And that simply got foreclosed when the emperor blew up during a meeting with one of the missionaries and said, "You idiots can't even speak Chinese and you want me to convert to your religion? Forget it. You're out of here. It's over." And that was a tragic event for China.
So, okay, so just for people who might not totally follow, I believe Dr. Jones is talking about the exposure to China in the late latter part of possibly the 17th or the 18th century, coming
No, 16th
century, coming in contact with Christianity and missionaries, possibly from the Vatican, and their rejection of it is the Qin dynasty or the different dynasties that were present at the time. And you're saying the rejection of Christianity or Jesus Christ as the moral guidance, or is made them incapable, or has set them back hundreds of years and made them capable of running
Right. How can I make a stupid claim like that?
Well,
Because you can frame it that way. That's exactly the problem that the missionaries confronted. So you have a Jesuit like Matteo Ricci, who comes to this country. First European there, he has to learn Chinese. I think of that. How would you like to show up and try and learn Chinese? I struggled with German when I was a teacher over there. Okay, so he learns Chinese. He writes one of the great classics in Chinese literature, and then he can only live for so long. He dies, and there's this controversy raging in the Vatican, the Chinese rights controversy about ancestor worship. Is it idolatry, or is it simply like going to the cemetery to put a wreath on your mother's grave? Well, the Jesuits thought it was that. The Franciscans or the other Dominicans, I believe, got involved. And suddenly you had people showing up in China from Portugal wearing long black robes, waving a crucifix, and trying to preach in translation. Not going to work. Not going to work. It failed miserably because look, there's precedent in Christianity about this. St. Paul said, "I preach Christ and him crucified," because he failed at the Areopagus to talk to the Greeks in their own language. Obviously, he spoke Greek, but to talk in philosophical terms. So what I'm talking about is the turning point in human history when St. John said, "God is Logos. Logos is God." So Ricci understood that. He went to China. He said, "I'm going to talk about Logos. I'm going to talk about astronomy. Here's an astrolabe. Here's a telescope. Let's have this conversation." And he was succeeding, and he was succeeded. He can only live so long. He died, and he was replaced by people who were basically cross-waving fundamentalists who wouldn't learn the language, and so their mission failed. The Jesuits are an alien body in the church right now, and they should be suppressed. But during the 16th century, they were heroic figures who could walk into the jungles of Paraguay and learn Guarani, or walk into the Gaspe Peninsula and learn Abnaki on the moose hunt, or walk into China and learn Chinese, because Logos is fundamentally language.
Yeah.
And if you don't learn the language, you can't talk to the people. So don't wave a crucifix around and think that's going to be a substitute for learning Chinese. Well, that's the lesson.
Yeah. All right. Well, Christianity didn't really work out in what was China at the time, but in modern times, I think there must be a couple of 100 million Christians in China, in the modern state of China.
Right. In spite of the failure, the gospel did spread throughout China. In spite of the human failure, which is a sign that the Catholic Church is a supernatural institution.
Perhaps, yeah, okay. And
it's proof.
But what we have here, since the middle of the last century, or perhaps since the beginning of the last century, was an influx of, I would say, either Westerners who don't believe in any God at all, and who just believe in money,
That's right. And do you know what they're called? Do you know what we call these people? Englishmen.
Yeah.
That's British imperialism. Their God is money. Their religion is capitalism, and they spread this religion throughout the world, and that was the great British Empire upon which the sun never set. And they took over places like India and basically deliberately prevented the spread of religion because they wanted to exploit them economically.
Well, really, well, people would have you believe that the British Empire spread religion and with their missionaries, no?
Yes, their religion is called capitalism, and their missionaries were capitalists.
Right? No, I mean, I'm talking about Christianity that people learn in school that the British Empire spread across the world, no?
It did spread across the world.
Sorry?
The religion was known as capitalism, but some people called it Presbyterianism. If you can make a distinction between Presbyterianism and capitalism, good luck. Okay. Try that out on Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia, classic example of what I'm talking about. Okay, it was French. Yeah. It was French. The French had the Micmac Indians had intermarried with the French. They were all Catholics. And then the Presbyterians show up and they tell them it's time to convert. And they said, well, no thanks. We're already Christians. No thanks. And at that point, the Presbyterians turn on the natives and start handing out bounties for scalps. And when they can't scalp enough of them, they deport them. They engage in the ethnic cleansing of the population of Nova Scotia, and they send them to Louisiana to die. They didn't die. They're known as Cajuns now, but that is British imperialism. It should not be confused with heroic figures like the Jesuits who went to Canada centuries before these people.
Okay, well, they're heroic now. The Jesuits, I thought they should be suppressed.
They're not heroic now. They're a bunch of homosexuals who are running a cabal run by George Soros. They should be suppressed. That's now, but they were heroic in the 16th century.
All right. And in terms of China, then the American or Anglo-American influence came in with the drug and opioid wars, right. And this led to a lot of riches for the decaying British Empire and then the rise in American Empire, and it led to people like the former Secretary of State, what's his name? He goes by John Kerry, but I believe his name was John Kuhn, or his father's name was Kuhn.
Right.
These guys seem to change their names when it suits them. But it led to people like him. He married into the Heinz company with the ketchup and they have quite a lot of money behind them. And that's a lot of riches. And this destroyed China, I guess, the societal impact of China, the size of China in the early century. And then with
China never got over the humiliation that Britain imposed on them during the Opium Wars, where British ships could sail up the rivers of China and simply bombard any city and destroy it. China has never gotten over that humiliation, and their assertion of their independence today is in many ways a direct reaction to the humiliation imposed on them by the British Empire during the Opium Wars.
Right. All right. Well, okay. And then we had a Japanese come into China, and then the communists then took over. And then they don't like religion. Wherever they are, either in the Soviet Union or China, they never liked religion. To be honest, I don't really think the Chinese are communists. They're just, so someone put it, I forgot who is the Chinese. The problem with the China is not they're communists, they're Chinese, whatever that means. And they probably have.
It was an alien imposition of an alien ideology on a traditional people, and it had catastrophic consequences, like the Great Leap Forward in 1957, where millions of Chinese starved to death because of Mao Zedong's crackpot industrialization scheme, followed by the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, which was run by a Jew, by the way, from the United States of America, Sidney Rittenberg. So it's been a catastrophe. And China is slowly recovering. But, another catastrophe was Milton Friedman, a different Jew imposing a different religion. This one's called capitalism on the same culture. And so you now have China where they have the worst of both worlds, the worst of Jewish Bolshevism and the worst of Jewish capitalism.
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, and I think that correlates with the development in the last 40 years that the Communist Party has implemented in China, which I believe they can't afford to go backwards on, or there will be massive revolts if the Chinese are revolutionary people which I believe they are. We saw both of that in the 1999 uprising. But the Chinese Communist Party can't afford to not give the Chinese people development.
No, wait a minute. No, wait a minute. Stop. That's not true. That's not true. They faced with, I met a Chinese woman. She was over here studying at the university. And she told me, this was years ago, that suddenly her salary had just been doubled. Now, this was a smart move on the part of the Chinese government because it opened up over 1 billion people as the basis for the Chinese economy. If you double the salaries of people, the purchasing power of the Chinese people now can absorb the huge amount of productivity that the Chinese factories are producing.
That's not really sustainable, is it? For 1 billion people, can't even imagine doing that in the West. Is that sustainable?
What sustainable? A population of 1 billion people?
Doubling the salary. No, doubling the salary of how.
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it's sustainable because the salaries had been kept at an artificially low level in order to sell junk over here at Walmart. And suddenly they realized this is a bad idea, and so they just doubled their own salaries and created a domestic market overnight.
Well, the factory of the world would move somewhere else, wouldn't it? And low-paid workers would be exploited somewhere else. But leave China.
That's the reason why you should never position yourself as the low-wage capital of the world, because there's always somewhere else that's going to underbid your prices.
Yeah, that's right. So China has the best of both worlds.
Worst of both worlds.
Well, yeah, in some instances, yeah. And from my perspective, there seems to be a coming, or at least a coming, everything that goes up must come down. There seems to be a coming either depression in the Chinese economy or the Chinese up the direction the Chinese is going, and that's partly because of the West. No, at some point.
Yeah, that's why it was smart to create a domestic market, because the West cannot be the stomach of the world forever. But the problem here is that you basically shut down the manufacturing base in the United States. You outsourced it to China, and the initial response is, yeah, lots of cheap junk flooding into the country. I think I'll go to Walmart and buy a T-shirt. Well, the problem here is that because you shut down the manufacturing in America, nobody's earning a decent wage anymore, and we can't buy your junk anymore. That's right. That's the problem with this model, this business model.
Okay, well, moving ahead, we've talked about a lot of things. Certain wars or conflicts are always in our more in our heads than other ones going on around the world. Syria, no one's talking about Syria anymore. No. I believe the end goal of all war planners and war instigators is just destruction, rather than any if they can't get what they want, they just want destruction. And Syria's been destroyed. For example, lots of wars going on in other places of the world springing up in the cradle of Christianity. In the cradle of Christianity, Ethiopia in the last year or so. Go on. Yeah.
Syria has been saved as a country, as an independent country, largely because of the efforts of the Russians and the Iranians. Syria is not Libya. There's a difference there. Okay, Libya was destroyed by Hillary Clinton and her feminist friends. Syria was not destroyed because of the intervention of Russia and Iran.
Wow. Well, who is it being destroyed by? It's been destroyed by everyone, right? And the enemy. I'm not
saying that war is a good idea. I'm not saying that people aren't dying. I'm saying that the country has not been destroyed. The Assad is still in power. He still has hegemony over most of the country. The fact that he can't expel the Turks or something like that is too bad, but that's part of the problem with war.
Sorry about that. Well, the issue is that either way, Syria has been destroyed beyond immensely, right?
No, it hasn't. It hasn't been destroyed.
And do you know what? The Russians did most of that.
It hasn't been destroyed. It's been preserved. The country has been preserved. It hasn't been destroyed.
For example, Palmyra wasn't preserved. That was done by ISIL or whoever ISIL is. 2017.
Look, you have to distinguish between buildings that got destroyed and the country. They're two separate things.
Well, the country itself has been 15 million people outside the country displaced, 6 million.
Look, I'm not trying to say war is a good thing. I'm saying that the West did not succeed in toppling the government of Syria
regime,
because of Russia and Iranian support.
Well, and the problem is the regime, not necessarily saying they're totally good or totally bad, is that they have helped or contributed to the destruction of their country because they believe, or Assad believes that he has some type of right to rule forever, right?
He was the legitimately elected head of that country. Who gave Hillary Clinton the right to depose Gaddafi? Who gave Hillary Clinton that right?
And you know what? I wish the Russians would have intervened in Libya. I really wish they would have done that rather than in Syria, right? But because Mr. Assad's father took power in the 1970s and he ruled until 2000, his brother was meant to take over, but he had a car crash in 2000. So Assad took over in 2000. And is it going to go forever? And just because this uprising came out of nowhere in 2011, probably by the CIA or Mossad influencing that, and he's reacted, or taking a reaction that has been overhand, that was definitely more than necessary, and has led to a total catastrophe in his country. And who's lost? Because the Zionists wanted to destroy either one way or the other. Whoever stays in power is not as important as the social and threats that Syria posed being destroyed. Right now, if I was Assad, I would have just said, "Why don't we talk? I love my country more than I love power." Whoever and
Well, this is we've been going for an hour.
Dr. Jones, I'm not sure what.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm back. Listen, we have gone for an hour. I told you I'd do an hour. That's it. I got to get off and I got to do something else. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
All right.
Please send me the link so that I can post it on my site.
Definitely. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, and then we'll catch up on time. Okay. This has been Dr. Jones with us today, and we're very pleased with that. Thank you very much. Okay. Have a nice day, Dr. Jones. Yep.
You too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.